Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I also rise today to speak in favour of the Safeguard Mechanism Crediting Amendment Bill 2022. I'd like to take the opportunity to commend the Minister for Climate Change and Energy and the Prime Minister for their hard work on this legislation, but particularly the extraordinary work of their departments. Deputy Speaker, the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report released this week confirms what we already know. There is a rapidly closing window for transformative climate action both here and around the world. This latest IPCC report shows global warming has increased at an unprecedented rate over the past decade, resulting in more frequent and severe droughts and cyclones. By the 2030s, every region in the world is expected to face increasing risks from climate change. And we know, Deputy Speaker, that Australians will experience increasing and increasingly devastating climate events, just as we have seen in these recent years. So after a decade of denial and delay, Australia finally has a government that is committed to taking serious action on climate change. And these reforms to the Safeguard Mechanism are the first opportunity in over a decade for action to bring down emissions from Australia's largest emitters. Deputy Speaker, this is an opportunity we can't afford to miss. Deputy Speaker, I recall spending hours talking to voters on pre-polls across Bean and meeting climate action communities during last year's election, but of course meeting the same Canberrans and Norfolk Islanders during the whole duration of the last term. These are issues they care about. A consistent issue raised with me was the need for responsible and effective action on climate change and emissions reductions. Public servants that I often spoke with raised with me about how ineffective the current Safeguard Mechanism was and how reforms to that mechanism could actually make a significant difference in a very quick way over the next 5 to 10 years. The Safeguard Mechanism, Deputy Speaker, is one of three existing components of the Emissions Reduction Fund, or ERF. The ERF has been one of the central policy tools supporting the achievement of the Australian Government's emission reduction targets in accordance with its nationally determined contribution under the Kyoto Protocol and, more recently, the Paris Agreement. It's a key to meeting the reduction targets that we have set for 2030. The Safeguard Mechanism was intended to ensure that the emissions reductions purchased through the ERF were not displaced by significant increases in emissions elsewhere in the economy. However, Deputy Speaker, the Safeguard Mechanism has been allowed to operate in a manner such that the emissions of covered facilities have increased in accordance with business as usual. It is essentially operated as an additional reporting mechanism rather than requiring covered facilities to reduce operational emissions, a perverse outcome. And more specifically, the emissions of covered facilities have increased by 7% since the commencement of the Safeguard Mechanism in 2016. Emissions are projected to increase further by 2030 unless we achieve change. An enhanced Safeguard Mechanism is a crucial building block, Deputy Speaker, for Australia's transition to net zero. As announced with our Powering Australia plan, it will require Australia's largest industrial facilities to reduce their emissions gradually and predictably in line with our national targets, but to do so with certainty. Now, Deputy Speaker, I do not wish to redredge history, but history matters. In 2009, the crossbenchers and opposition at the time blocked then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's carbon pollution reduction scheme. The Australian people were then forced into a decade of climate change inaction because it was decided by a few that it wasn't good enough for them, and so the whole country would have to go without. Deputy Speaker, as someone who worked for more than a decade in science and engineering advocacy, I know the extent of the opportunity that was missed. Deputy Speaker, last year the Albanese Labor Party went to the Australian people with a proposal and said, we can get 43% emissions reductions by 2030 an achievable and meaningful reduction that will both encourage innovations in industry and won't cripple business. On May 22nd, the Australian people said emphatically yes to that proposal. We have here today a bill that will ensure this country meets its emissions reductions targets and our international obligations. We have before this House legislation that makes it possible for climate action to happen. The Albanese government was elected because we listened and created a policy that reduces our country's emissions without needing to cripple industry. By lowering the cost of reducing emissions, crediting and trading will help the safeguard mechanism meet Australia's climate targets in a cost-effective way and enable increased ambition over time. Kerry Schott, the chair of the Energy Security Board from 2018 to 2021, the nation's top climate advisor to successive Commonwealth governments, has described this policy as a really important policy measure to reduce emissions, and that delaying the implementation of this legislation by even a year, the emissions reduction targets of the facilities with the heaviest pollution will become even more difficult to reach. These reforms are critical to contribute about 30% of the cuts needed to deliver on Australia's legally binding target to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint by 43% by 2030. At the end of the day, Deputy Speaker, Australia will be locked into 43% by 2030. This is a floor. This is the minimum. We could actually achieve a higher reduction, but this country will not achieve anything if this legislation that some people, as the previous speaker said, think doesn't go too far or goes too far, is not passed. And Deputy Speaker, to those opposite who've long championed the need for every market to run efficiently, this legislation targets inefficiencies in our emissions markets. This bill addresses one element of the reforms, crediting. It aims to support and encourage industry to unlock emissions reductions where they are most efficient. Under this bill, some businesses that have low-cost abatement opportunities ready to go could reduce their emissions faster than required by the safeguard mechanism. To incentivise such action, the bill enables these businesses to be issued tradable safeguard mechanism credits, and other businesses with more limited abatement options could buy these credits to help meet their required emissions reductions. Deputy Speaker, I'd like to remind the House about what some of the country's industry leaders and businesses are saying about this legislation. From the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, with the new climate change legislation committing Australia to reduce national emissions by 43% below 2005 levels by 2030 and achieve net zero by 2050, changes to the design of the safeguard mechanism are essential. From the Australian Aluminium Council, the focus of policy design for safeguard mechanism should be on establishing a framework to maintain industry, jobs and competitiveness while also decarbonising through the period to 2030 and beyond to achieve net zero by 2050. The success of this policy will not be measured in 2030 alone, but in the transformation of Australia's industry in the biggest clean industrial and economic revolution this country has seen. And from Rio Tinto, another group of radicals, Rio Tinto supports the use of a reformed safeguard mechanism as part of a suite of policy measures to incentivise genuine industrial abatement. And, Deputy Speaker, finally, the Energy Efficiency Council. The Energy Efficiency Council strongly supports the government's proposal to enhance the safeguard mechanism by declining facility baselines. Overall, the EEC believes that reforms to the safeguard mechanism should make a substantial contribution to Australia's emissions reduction targets and jumpstart the transition to achieving a net zero economy no later than 2050. Deputy Speaker, it is clear that there is genuine support and demand for these reforms. This certainly doesn't sound like the Armageddon that those opposite in different parts of the chamber seem to think for different reasons. It sounds like industry has been waiting for an adult government to prepare achievable, mature policy that encourages innovation and drives efficiency. Australian businesses and their investors know the world is changing. and that they need the right signals in place to not just stay competitive but to innovate and thrive. Many businesses that operate facilities covered by the Safeguard mechanism have made long-term climate commitments that match or surpass Australia's climate targets and demonstrate great levels of business frustration with the former government's lack of strong and coherent climate action policy. We cannot be surprised, Deputy Speaker, that it's once again up to a transparent, climate-conscious and responsible Labor government to legislate policy that isn't a smokescreen but endeavours to deliver on this country's climate obligations. Deputy Speaker, in September 2022, this parliament enacted the Albanese government's Climate Change Act 2022, which set out national emissions reduction targets of a 43% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero by 2050. It was the beginning of this government's plan to ensure that Australia meets its target of being a net zero country by 2050. The Safeguard Mechanism Amendment Bill 2022 complements this government's responsible and effective approach to reducing emissions. Reforms to the Safeguard Mechanism will provide strong investment signals and provide a balanced scheme that is effective, equitable, efficient and simple. Those constituents that came to me during the election and during the term of the last parliament concerned about the integrity of the Australian carbon credit units, your concerns were heard, and the Australian government commissioned the independent review of ACCCUs to ensure that they will be, and the carbon crediting framework will have integrity and maintain a strong and credible reputation. The expert panel concluded that the ACCU scheme arrangements are sound. And further to this, industrial emitters will have a strong incentive to reduce their emissions, but many and hard-to-abate sectors will need options to use credits from those facilities beating their baselines or high-integrity carbon offsets. Deputy Speaker, a broad coalition of business leaders and groups support reforming the Safeguard Mechanism to provide policy certainty for large industrial emitters, and most importantly, the Australian people made it clear that they wanted a policy that delivers on climate change, delivers on industry innovation and doesn't hurt business. They made this view clear and delivered the Albanese Labor government a mandate to get this done. This legislation complements the Albanese government's approach to deliver tangible change in emission reductions and ensure that this country will reach its goal of 43% reductions by 2030 and to be a net zero country by 2050. I thank again the Minister and the Prime Minister for their hard work and the hard work of those public servants that have brought this bill to this parliament, and I commend this bill to the House.